They say he was mad, that he made his horse a consul, that he slept with all three of his sisters, that he forced Roman nobles to lick his feet as a sign of loyalty, then sneered as they grovelled like little dogs, that he threw golden feasts, dissolved pearls in vinegar, and drank it instead of wine, that he once ordered his soldiers to collect seashells, then declared it a victory over the ocean. It sounds like a sick comedy, and indeed that's how it was written by the most celebrated pens of the time, Suetonius, Dio Cassius, Tacitus. Men who lived decades, even centuries after Caligula. Men driven by political motives, personal grudges, or simply the love of a sensational tale over the cold edge of truth. And so for nearly 2,000 years, Caligula has lived on in human memory, as the symbol of power unhinged of raw madness crowned in gold. Every time someone mentions a cruel, unstable leader, Caligula reappears grinning madly in the flickering firelight of ancient Rome. But what if he wasn't mad? What if he was simply too clear-headed for an empire built on lies? What if what we call madness was actually a desperate attempt to survive in a system where kindness meant weakness and honesty was treason? What if Caligula wasn't a deranged murderer, but a child of power, orphaned and dragged through the blood-soaked halls of empire, forced to learn how to laugh like a beast just to avoid being devoured? In this video, we won't try to defend Caligula. No. The truth doesn't need a lawyer. Instead, we'll dig beneath the dusty layers of history, not to find some forgotten saint, but to peel back the mask of history itself, the history written by victors, by the survivors of Caligula's reign, the ones who twisted truth to feed their fear, their power, and their legacy. Caligula, Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, Little Boots, the empire's pet name for him, a Roman monster, or a mirror reflecting the rot of a system decaying from within. This story begins not on a throne, but in the tiny palm of a child born into empire, raised in death, and ruling with a sneer at fate. He was born into a cradle of marble under ceilings gilded with imperial eagles. But make no mistake, his lullabies were sung by whispers of betrayal, and the hands that rocked his cradle were already stained with blood. August 31st at 12 AD. In the seaside town of Antium, a boy named Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus came screaming into the world. Rome would one day know him by another name, a nickname, a joke really. Caligula Little Boots, they called him. The kind of name a soldier gives a child who doesn't yet understand war, but walks through camps dressed like one. But this was no innocent world for a child. His father was Germanicus, the golden boy of Rome, the people's general, the soldier's idol, a living myth in the making. Nephew and adopted son of Emperor Tiberius Germanicus, was the heir that Rome wanted, even if Tiberius didn't. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, was granddaughter of Augustus himself, royal blood carved into flesh. She was fierce, proud, and politically lethal, a dangerous combination for a woman in Rome. Together, they had 9 children. 6 died young. The empire chewed through them like stale bread. And those who survived would learn that in Rome, survival was not a gift, it was a curse waiting to mature. Gaius, our Little Boots, spent his early childhood on the move from the palaces of Italy to the muddy front lines of Germania. His mother dressed him in a tiny soldier's uniform to win the hearts of the legions. And it worked. The men adored him. They gave him the boots. They gave him the nickname. They made him their mascot. But Rome was no place for mascots. At just 2 years old, Gaius travelled with his family to the front lines. And when the legions mutinied after Augustus's death, threatening to tear apart the empire in mourning, it was this tiny boy lifted high in his mother's arms who helped quell the rage. A child used as a shield against swords, drawn by men who called themselves Roman. That moment right there, that was his first lesson, that love in Rome is tactical and loyalty is a coin tossed like dice. His father died mysteriously in Syria in 19 AD. Official cause illness. Unofficial suspicion Tiberius. Some whispered poison. Some said Sejanus, the Praetorian puppet master, wanted Germanicus out of the way. Whatever the truth, young Caligula walked in the funeral procession, silent beside the ashes of the father Rome claimed to love, but did not protect. Not long after his mother Agrippina dared to speak against the emperor. She believed Tiberius had killed her husband, so she defied him, publicly, proudly, stupidly. She was exiled in 29 AD. She starved to death 4 years later. One by one, Gaius watched his family disintegrate. His older brothers Nero and Drusus Caesar were accused of plotting against the emperor. One was exiled, the other imprisoned. Both died. At age 17, Caligula had lost his father, his mother, and his brothers not to war or plague or the gods, but to the Senate, the palace, the system. The civilized machinery of Roman power had ground his family into dust. And yet, he survived. He was not executed. He was not exiled. He did something far more dangerous. He adapted. At the island fortress of Capri, where Tiberius had retreated from the stink of Rome, Caligula was summoned to live like a butterfly kept in a cage of obsidian. There, surrounded by luxury and surveillance, he learned the art of smiling with dead eyes. He watched, he listened, he pretended. Sources tell us that while his family withered, Caligula never complained, never protested, never raised a whisper against Tiberius. They called it obedience. Maybe it was. Or maybe it was something colder survival through silence. It was at Capri that the final piece was set. The old emperor, childless in spirit, if not in name, had to choose between Gaius and a timid boy named Gemellus. He split the inheritance in his will, a coward's move, but fate made the decision for him. Tiberius died in 37 AD. Some say Caligula smothered him with a pillow. Some say the Praetorians did it for him. Some say he did nothing at all and only watched. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus Little Boots was now Emperor of Rome. And if you think that sounds like a fairy tale ending, you haven't been paying attention. This wasn't the end of his trauma. It was just the beginning of his reign. And Rome was about to meet the child it had orphaned, dressed in purple robes crowned in laurel, and smiling like he'd finally learned how to play their game. Tiberius was dead, or murdered, or simply suffocated under the weight of his own paranoia. The sources don't agree. Maybe a pillow was involved. Maybe it was natural causes. Maybe Caligula watched it happen with all the emotional engagement of a man choosing wine. Whatever the truth, the old emperor's body was cold by March of 37 AD, and before it even cooled, Rome was already cheering. Because for the first time in decades, there was hope. Not just a new ruler, but a new kind of ruler. Young, charismatic. A living link to the golden age of Augustus. A prince born of Germanicus, the people's hero. A survivor of court intrigue, yet seemingly untouched by bitterness. At just 24 years old, Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus was proclaimed imperator by the Praetorians on the very day Tiberius died. The Senate followed suit, declaring the old emperor's will null and void on grounds of mental instability, which is Roman, for we never liked him anyway. And so began what many Romans thought was a renaissance. As Caligula made his slow procession into Rome, crowds flooded the streets. Old veterans wept. Mothers lifted their children to glimpse the boy they had once seen in little boots, now dressed in purple. Coins were minted with his image before he'd even reached the gates. The city hadn't felt this alive since the days of Augustus. Caligula stepped onto the throne like a man returning to something that was always his. And for a moment, just a moment, it felt like history had corrected itself. His first acts were not those of a tyrant. They were those of a healer. He granted amnesty to political prisoners. The infamous Maestas trials, those toxic show trials where one could be executed for a stray joke or a missed greeting, were abolished. All records of them were publicly burned. The exiled were recalled. The imprisoned were freed. The air tasted different. He promised to work alongside the Senate to restore balance. to revive the forgotten traditions that Tiberius had ignored or buried under layers of fear. And the Senate, terrified, as always cheered like drunken schoolboys. But it wasn't just talk. Caligula took action. He paid the bequests promised by Tiberius to the army and people, money the Senate likely hoped to keep for themselves. He even added more of his own. Food distributions were expanded. Games returned to the calendar in lavish style. Actors and entertainers banned under Tiberius were welcomed back to the capital. Laughter, not whispers, began to fill the streets. And he didn't stop there. He personally travelled to the islands where his mother and brother had died. He gathered their bones with his own hands, not servants, not priests, and carried them back to Rome. In a funeral procession, styled like a triumph, their remains were interred in Augustus's mausoleum. Statues of his parents and brothers were raised. September was renamed in honour of Germanicus. Coins were struck, altars, dedicated games announced in their memory. Rome hadn't seen public mourning used like this since the Republic. This wasn't pageantry, it was reclamation. Caligula wasn't just honouring his bloodline, he was rewriting the narrative that had damned them, and the people loved him for it. But there was something deeper, more radical happening behind the ceremonies and festivals. A quiet revolution was brewing, one made of policies, not proclamations. He lifted the veil on the empire's finances, publishing the once secret accounts of imperial spending. Taxes were reduced, even abolished in some regions. The harsh inheritance tax from Augustus's time gone. The long-forgotten provincial elite were given access to equestrian and even senatorial ranks. Magistrate elections, once handed over to the Senate, were returned to the people. The provinces began to whisper a word they hadn't dared use in years: dignity. He began restoring and funding long-neglected public works. Theatres reopened. Aqueducts resumed construction. A new amphitheatre was planned. Rome pulsed with noise and labour, again not from the chants of executions, but from the sound of chisels and scaffolding. For the first time in a generation, the empire wasn't shrinking inward in fear, it was stretching toward the sky. Of course, cynics in the Senate muttered that it was all too much, too generous, too flamboyant. But those were the same men who had bowed to Tiberius's cold austerity and called it prudence. Their complaints sounded more like envy than concern. And Caligula? He smiled and bowed. He offered olive branches and flattery. But his eyes watched. Because underneath the applause, the flowers, the golden laurel crowns, he knew exactly what kind of Rome he ruled. He knew what the Senate had done to his family. He knew who had survived by stepping on the necks of the fallen, and so he gave them what they wanted. He played the Golden Prince, the Saviour Emperor, the second coming of Augustus. But somewhere deep within the boy, who had once walked through army camps in tiny boots, a darker part of him waited. Not yet. Not now. For the moment Rome believed they had a god in the making, they were half right. He wasn't a god. But he had survived gods, emperors, and traitors, and now he ruled over them. For 6 glorious months, it seemed as if Rome had awoken from a nightmare. The streets echoed with laughter, not accusations. Trials of treason gave way to races, games, and poetry. Children wore laurel crowns instead of funeral black. Senators toasted the emperor in public and gnashed their teeth in private. The people, the mob plebs urbana, chanted his name in the forum. But kindness in Rome is a dangerous game, especially when played too well. Then sometime around September of 37 AD, the story cracked. Caligula fell ill, very ill. We don't know what it was. Fever poisoned, some divine punishment according to the augurs. But what we do know is that for weeks Rome stood still. The streets outside the Palatine Hill were choked with crowds praying, sacrificing, weeping. There were candlelit vigils. Even the Senate held sessions in silence, waiting, trembling, not from love, but from fear. Because Caligula had no biological heir. He had only adopted Gemellus Tiberius's frail, barely teenage grandson, a choice made more from politics than affection. And in the shadows, old ambitions stirred. Macro, The powerful Praetorian prefect, who had helped place Caligula on the throne, began maneuvering. If the emperor died, Gemellus could be emperor. And Macro, as his guardian, would become the new kingmaker. Again. Some even say Macro's wife Ennia whispered in Caligula's ear that she was the empress he needed, that they could rule together. The implication was clear. The fever broke. Caligula recovered, and Rome exhaled in relief. But Caligula was not the same. He had gone to the edge of the abyss and stared back at a Rome ready to move on without him. A senate ready to pivot. A prefect already measuring the next laurel wreath. He emerged from his sickbed, not weakened, but sharpened. The golden boy died in that fever. The emperor was born. He moved quickly. Gemellus was accused of plotting against him. The boy was forced to take his own life, an execution wrapped in ceremony. Caligula reportedly gave him a dagger and instructions. Some say soldiers did the job instead. Then Macro, stripped of his titles, sent to Egypt under the guise of promotion. But he never made it. He and his wife committed suicide before a trial could disgrace them. And with that, the emperor severed his last leash. What followed wasn't bloodlust. It was strategy. The Senate had never loved him. He knew that. They had toasted his father Germanicus, then stood silent as he was murdered. They had bowed to his mother, then applauded when she starved in exile. Now they clapped for him. Caligula wasn't fooled. He didn't want their friendship. He wanted to teach them a lesson. It started subtly. He invited senators to banquets but seated them next to actors and gladiators. He praised mimes and jesters more than magistrates. He mocked the old aristocracy by elevating outsiders. The crowd cheered. The Senate squirmed. He began reassigning powers. He returned elections to the people, stripping the Senate of one of its few remaining functions. He abolished sales taxes across Italy, winning the hearts of merchants and craftsmen. He admitted provincials into the equestrian class, opening the gates of privilege to men whose ancestors had once been slaves. To the elites, it was treason. To the people, it was justice. He understood Rome better than any of them. Power, he realized, wasn't held by marble or bloodlines. It was held by bread and spectacle, by laughter and fear. And he had learned both on Capri, from Tiberius's silence, and from the whip of Sejanus. Now he wielded them. But he still smiled, still bowed in public, still spoke of peace and family and tradition. He built temples. He honored the gods. He restored forgotten festivals. And all the while behind the curtain, he watched his enemies bow and waited for them to blink. Rome once again had a Caesar on the throne. But this time, Caesar wasn't going to play nice. Rome, by its very nature, was a performance. Its senators wore masks made of virtue, its emperors spoke in riddles, and behind every marble column was a dagger half drawn. Caligula understood this, perhaps too well. He had spent his youth on the stage of power watching, mimicking, surviving. Now seated on the throne, he turned the empire into his own theatre, and every senator, every equestrian, every trembling noble became a part of the cast, whether they liked it or not. At first it was subtle, a changed seating arrangement at a banquet, a snub so slight it might be unintentional, the sudden promotion of a nobody, an actor, a mime, a charioteer into the circles of privilege. The message wasn't loud. It was whispered in silk and served with wine. Your birth no longer protects you. Then the whispers became thunder. He began hosting feasts that made a mockery of tradition. Gone were the measured banquets of Tiberius's cold court. In their place came spectacles of such excess that the marble walls themselves seemed to sweat gold. It is said that Caligula drank vinegar with dissolved pearls, not because he enjoyed it, but because it was absurd, and the absurdity was the point. The dishes gleamed with edible gold leaf. The centerpieces were statues of gods modeled after himself, and seated beside him in places of honor, once reserved for consuls and generals, were the unspeakables dancers, freedmen, his sisters. Even his horse Incitatus was said to receive more respect than Rome's oldest bloodlines. Some say he planned to make Incitatus a consul. Most believe this was a joke, and they may be right. But in Rome, jokes could be more dangerous than decrees. When Caligula draped his horse in purple and fed it from an ivory manger, he wasn't mad. He was making a point so loud it echoed through every marble villa from Palatine to Pompeii. If my horse is worth more than you, what does that say about your Senate? The aristocracy clenched their jaws and bowed deeper, but resentment curdled in their bellies. He abolished reserved seating in theatres. Senators were now forced to sit among the plebs shoulder to shoulder, with the sweat and stink of the very people they had ruled over for centuries. A calculated humiliation. No longer could they watch the games from their dignified perches. Now they fought for space like commoners stripped of the distance that once protected them from the mob's laughter. Yet it didn't stop there. He opened what some sources claim was a brothel in the palace, filled not with whores, but with the wives and daughters of the senatorial class. It was never confirmed. It may never have existed. But the rumor alone was enough to stain reputations, to break homes, to turn whispers into screams behind closed doors. The reality didn't matter. The fear did. And Caligula understood fear like a language. He spoke it fluently. When he hosted games, he chose gladiators not just for skill, but for spectacle. He took the field himself, sparring with swords, playing the god of blood under the eyes of an empire. He invited the crowd to watch senators flinch. He lavished gifts on charioteers and actors, men of low birth, and watched as the old guards squirmed beneath their togas. It wasn't madness. It was retribution, served slowly and with a grin. Behind all of it, behind the banquets, the horses, the theatre, was a kind of genius that history has refused to admit. Caligula wasn't destroying tradition for pleasure. He was exposing it, stripping it bare, holding a mirror to Rome and asking the unaskable, what do we really worship here? Bloodlines, or performance virtue, or fear, power, or illusion? And the mirror cracked. They called him a madman because it was easier than calling him right. They whispered that he was possessed, deranged, unfit, because the alternative that he saw through them was unbearable. So they laughed when he dressed as a god, when he demanded temples in his honor, when he replaced Senate privilege with public spectacle. They pointed and snickered and wrote him into legend as a lunatic. But deep down they knew. He was doing what they never dared, turning Rome against itself, using its own rituals, its own grandeur, its own arrogance as weapons. And in doing so, he stepped beyond emperor. He became myth. Not the kind carved in marble, but the kind that haunts dreams. A boy orphaned by power, now wielding it like a torch in a dry forest. The theatre of revenge was open. The curtain was drawn. The actors were sweating. And Caligula, in the center of it all, wasn't performing madness. He was directing the show. They said he was preparing to invade Britain. That legions gathered along the northern frontiers, orders were issued. Horses shod weapons sharpened. There were reports of armor glinting in the sun near the Rhine, of ships being fitted to cross the channel, of Caligula himself in military dress, inspecting ranks, whispering commands. For the first time since the days of Julius Caesar, it seemed Rome might stretch its iron fingers across the sea once more. But when the time came to act, the legions did not move. No invasion launched, no cities burned, no conquests sung. Instead, Caligula gave a very different order. He told his men to kneel, to gather seashells, not gold, not land, not blood, shells. The ancient sources say he claimed it was spoils of war from Neptune, god of the sea. That the shells were trophies of a victorious campaign against the ocean itself. They say he marched his soldiers up and down the shore in full armor, barking commands, then paraded them back to Rome with baskets full of marine debris. They say he was insane. But maybe they misunderstood the joke. The Rhine frontier was a mess. The legions, long under poor leadership, were bloated with corruption and indiscipline. The commander of Upper Germany, Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Gaetulicus, had held the post for a decade too long by Roman standards, and rumors swirled that his loyalty to Caligula was negotiable. A second conspiracy had brewed quietly among general senators and even two of Caligula's own sisters, frustrated by their exclusion from the line of succession after the birth of his daughter. The plan was simple: remove. Caligula install a puppet, restore the old ways. But the emperor moved first. Without warning, he left Umbria and rode north at a punishing pace. No grand announcements, no banners, just speed and surprise. By the time he arrived, it was too late for the conspirators to coordinate. Gaius was arrested and executed. The Praetorian guards were paid handsomely. The traitorous sisters were banished. Their ally, the noble Lepidus, was dragged into a public trial and put to death. And only then came the order to collect seashells. Was it absurd? Absolutely. But was it meaningless? Not in the least. This was no divine crusade against Poseidon. It was a message, a humiliation, a stage play directed by a master of symbolism. The soldiers who had once conspired now found themselves groveling on a beach collecting garbage for an emperor who knew exactly what they had planned. There would be no conquest, not of Britain nor of Rome, only submission. He had turned a campaign into a satire, and the satire into power. When he returned to Gaul, he held a mock triumph displaying the shells as spoils of war. Some say he gave them names like enemy kings. Others claim he held the baskets high and proclaimed victory over the sea. Historians would later use this to paint him mad. But mad men don't eliminate plots in secret, humiliate armies in broad daylight, and return to thunderous applause. In Lyon he staged games and auctions. The property of his disgraced sisters and the treasures of the imperial household were sold off, not just to refill the treasury, but to let the provinces buy a piece of Rome itself. Gold that once belonged to Augustus now passed through Gallic fingers. The message was clear: power flows from the emperor, not from tradition. The nearby town of Vienna was granted Roman citizenship. The border provinces, long ignored, were showered with gifts and attention. And the senators. They were kept in Rome, far from the action-writing poems, to flatter a man who no longer pretended to care. By the time Caligula returned to the capital on his 28th birthday, he had reshaped the military command, crushed two conspiracies, humiliated the Senate, elevated the provinces, and declared a mock war on the sea, and won. He entered Rome not as a conqueror of nations, but as the conqueror of narratives. And yet behind the cheers and the drums and the gilded chariots, there was an unease. The senators smiled too widely. The nobles clapped too hard. Because deep down, they knew this was no longer a prince who ruled by lineage or compromise. This was an emperor who ruled by theatre. And in his theatre, the price of treason was laughter. It's easy to call someone mad when they refuse to play your game. Easier still when they win. For centuries, that's how Caligula's story has been told, through the cracked lenses of old men in togas scribbling after the fact, after the blood had dried and the new emperor had paid for their silence. They called him insane, unhinged, delusional. But madness, real madness, is erratic. Caligula was never erratic. He was precise. His reign was no collapse of reason, it was the weaponization of spectacle. And somewhere along the way, he realized that nothing unnerves the powerful more than a man who not only breaks the rules, but laughs while doing it. When he returned to Rome after the Rhine, he didn't stage a triumph. He forbade it. No parades, no honorifics, no crawling senators outside the gates. He turned his back on the rituals they'd prepared and retreated to his seaside villa near Puteoli. And then, like a demigod from myth, he built a bridge across the Bay of Baiae. Not a metaphorical one, a literal one. Barges were lined up across 3 miles of sea covered in planks and earth made into a floating road. Caligula, dressed in the breastplate of Alexander the Great, rode his chariot across it with priests and soldiers trailing behind. Sacrifices were made. Wine flowed. And on the second day, he rode back with spoils and guests in tow, dining on a platform at sea, while fireworks cracked above him. Then he ordered the bridge dismantled and hurled people into the waters for his amusement. Why some said it was madness. Others said he built it to mock an astrologer who once claimed he had as much chance of becoming emperor as riding a horse across the sea. Maybe he remembered. Maybe he didn't. But the bridge stood, and every man who doubted him laughed at him, whispered about him now, watched from the shore as he rewrote the meaning of what a Roman emperor could be. Soon after came the temple, not to Jupiter, to Drusilla, his sister, his closest companion, his alleged lover, according to later sources hungry for scandal. She had died unexpectedly the year before, and Caligula had grieved like no emperor before him. He refused to cut his hair. He wandered. He wept in public. And then he did something Rome could not tolerate. He made her a goddess. A real one. Temples, priests, annual games in her name, her image placed in sacred processions. The Senate balked. The people stared, but no one stopped him. They couldn't. Because beneath the surface, things were shifting. The Senate, ever two-faced, continued to flatter him in public and conspire in private. Denunciations became common. Trials returned. Not the old majestas trials of vague disloyalty, but sharper ones, more personal. And Caligula, no longer interested in placation, struck back. He removed consuls mid-term, publicly. He dissolved alliances with the old elite. He took their statues down from public places, banned their family titles, forced them to grovel at his feet in theatres, in courts, in Senate halls. He played with them like a child plays with beetles, carefully, curiously, and then with sudden cruelty. When they offered him praise, he refused it. When they offered him sacrifice, he scorned it. And when they tried to ignore him, he became a god. He never officially declared divinity, not the way later emperors would, but he stopped correcting those who did. Statues of himself as Jupiter, as Apollo, even as Venus, appeared across the empire. He dressed as gods at festivals. He made senators take oaths, not just to him, but to his divine spirit. Was it delusion, or was it a mirror held up to Rome to show them the absurdity of their own traditions? Because that's what Rome had become, a place where power was worshipped, not questioned, where emperors were divine when convenient and demonic when dead. Caligula merely pointed it out, loudly, and if he laughed while doing it well, that only made it worse. He took the aristocracy's rules and rewrote them as parody. He kissed commoners and ignored patricians. He gave speeches where he wept for the Republic, then mocked it moments later. He would offer his hand to be kissed by nobles, then extend his foot instead. He appointed men of no heritage to high office, then threatened to make his horse a consul, not to elevate the horse, but to degrade the office. It wasn't insanity. It was insult turned into policy. The Senate seethed. They called it tyranny, but they had no answer for it. And behind the theatre he ruled. The economy, despite rumours, remained stable. Building projects resumed. Tax burdens were lifted from the poor. The provinces were given unprecedented attention. Public entertainment flourished. Rome, for all its scandal and noise, was functioning. But functioning was not enough for Rome's elite. They needed to feel important. They needed to feel safe. Caligula gave them neither. Instead, he gave them uncertainty. Every day, every meeting, every smile. And as fear metastasized into hatred, another conspiracy began to bloom. Quietly, carefully, among the guards, among the bureaucrats, among the very men who once toasted his health and kissed his robe. Because Rome could tolerate excess, it could tolerate cruelty, it could even tolerate a god, but it could not tolerate being laughed at. And Caligula, emperor, actor, orphan, and oracle, had made the whole empire into a punchline. It happened in the corridor between performances, between sacrifice and applause, between the old gods and the new mask he had made for himself. Fitting, really. For a man who turned Rome into theatre, it would be the stage itself where he met his end. January 41st AD. The emperor had planned a trip to Alexandria. Some say he was preparing to move the imperial capital eastward toward a city where gods and kings already blurred together in marble and myth. Others believed he was simply fleeing the suffocating paranoia of Rome. But before he could leave, he stopped to attend a series of performances in the imperial theatre. He opened with a sacrifice to Augustus, ever the ghost in the corner. The crowd cheered. The Senate smiled. The knives were already drawn. The man who led it was Cassius Chaerea, a praetorian tribune. An officer Caligula had mocked one too many times. He called him weak, feminine, soft-spoken, gave him the most degrading tasks, assigned him, rumor has it, to oversee executions while making jokes about his voice. For a Roman man of rank, that wasn't just insult. It was a wound that never closed, and Caligula didn't care. Or maybe he did. Maybe he saw what was growing behind Chaerea's eyes and chose not to stop it. Or maybe he simply couldn't imagine that the man he had humiliated would strike back. He did. On January 24th, as Caligula made his way through a narrow passage behind the theatre, separated from his entourage, Chaerea approached. Some say he called out a passphrase, and when Caligula turned, the first blow was struck. Others say there was no signal at all, just steel on flesh, sudden and brutal. What followed was a frenzy. Sabinus, another tribune, joined in. So did a handful of centurions. Blades flashed in the dim torchlight. The emperor, once a god on stage, now collapsed in blood on the floor. Young, stunned, betrayed. He did not die alone. His wife, Milonia Cisonia, was murdered shortly after. Some say she begged for it, others that she tried to shield him. His infant daughter, Julia Drusilla, was killed by a soldier. No trial, no hesitation. Just the swift, pitiless efficiency of a Rome that had made up its mind. Outside chaos, the Germanic bodyguard, fiercely loyal, retaliated. Some conspirators were killed on the spot. Others fled. In the Senate, panic. Should they restore the Republic, appoint a new princeps? Reopen the temples to the old gods and pretend none of this ever happened? They debated for hours. They postured. They made speeches to no one. And while they argued over the corpse of an emperor, the Praetorian Guard made their move. Deep in the palace, they found a nervous, stammering man hiding behind a curtain, Claudius Caligula's uncle, the least dangerous member of the Julio-Claudian family. Lame scholarly considered a joke by most. They dragged him out and crowned him emperor. The Senate once again bowed, and history once again rewrote itself. The conspirators were hunted down. Sabinus took his own life. The others were executed not as heroes of the Republic, but as traitors to the empire. Rome had no interest in remembering them kindly. They had not restored virtue. They had merely removed a nuisance. And Caligula, dead at 28, was embalmed in ridicule. The histories were written with venom. He was mad, they said. A monster, a pervert, a tyrant. He slept with his sisters. He married the moon. He wanted to make his horse a god. No mention of the amnesties, the tax relief, the restoration of public games, the promotion of provincial elites, the crackdown on military corruption, the end of the Maestas trials. No, those didn't make the cut. They never do, because Rome did not just kill Caligula. It murdered the idea of what he had become, a mirror, a threat, a man who dared to laugh at power from the center of it. And in killing him, Rome could look away again. History prefers its villains simple. A madman with a crown, a tyrant drunk on power, a cruel boy king who drowned Rome in gold and blood. Easier that way, easier to remember, easier to dismiss. But Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus Caligula was never simple. He was born into a bloodline cursed by its own ambition. He watched his father die under mysterious orders, his mother starve in exile, his brothers imprisoned and erased. He grew up in a palace soaked with whispered threats and forced smiles, surviving not by sword or title, but by silence. And when the throne was finally his, when the people cheered and the Senate bowed, he tried, truly tried, to be something Rome had long forgotten. A leader who forgave, a prince who laughed, a man who remembered. He abolished the terror of Tiberius, freed the falsely accused, opened the treasury. fed the people, honored the dead. For a few brief golden months, he brought hope to an empire that had long since buried it beneath paranoia and marble. And then he got sick. And when he rose from that sickness, Rome met a new kind of emperor, one who didn't forget, one who had looked death in the face and seen Rome standing beside it, sharpening a knife. Caligula's reign after that moment became something else entirely. Not madness, not chaos, something far more dangerous. Clarity. He saw the Senate for what it was, a nest of cowards and conspirators, worshipping tradition not out of love, but convenience. He saw their flattery, their oaths, their statues, and spat in their faces by making his horse a consul. He knew what they whispered, so he said it louder. Dressed as gods, built floating bridges, declared his dead sister divine. Not because he believed he was a god, but because he knew they would believe anything if power told them to. He weaponized their own hypocrisy, turned Rome into a play, and cast them all in roles they couldn't refuse. And so they did what Rome always does when it feels mocked. They killed him. And afterward, they wrote the script, the official version, the truth, that he was mad, that he was incestuous, that he thought himself divine. But if he truly believed he was a god, why did he die like a man? Why did his enemies need blades, lies and silence to erase him? Why did the people, those who danced in his games, drank from his fountains, laughed at his shows, weep when the news broke? Maybe because the truth isn't that he was mad. Maybe the truth is that he wasn't mad enough to play the game their way. Or maybe he was the only one sane enough to see the game for what it was. A system built not on honor or justice, but on performance, theater, masks, and the only unforgivable sin in a society like that is pulling the curtain back. Caligula didn't just rule Rome, he exposed it, and for that they called him a monster. But maybe, just maybe, he was the only man in the room who wasn't pretending.